Thor. A Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 1 in the Heart of Ice series. Written by Demelza Carlton. 24. I don't believe it. It's not here. Sybil's anger simmered in the air. Thor wished he could punch whichever man or men were the source of it, but there was no one in this enormous building, but the two of them. I'll check again in case I missed something, she said. Once more, she methodically opened each of the boxes, examining the contents, before closing each one and moving on to the next. Thor spotted a number of arrows, some familiar and some very crude, a shoe, several pieces of bedraggled cloth, a bunch of bones that looked like they'd once belonged to a horse or three, and a reindeer training harness. I haven't seen one of these in years. Not since we ran out of fodder one long cold winter, so we had to slaughter everything but the goats. The ground was still frozen when we should have been plowing and planting, so I announced that I'd train the goats to pull the plow. Everyone laughed, thinking it a great jest, but I found a reindeer training harness that fitted around their horns and hitched them up to a cart. It took time and patience and a lot of cursing, enough for some of the men to go out in search of oxen or horses or even reindeer to replace what we'd lost. But I did it. Those goats were the best matched pair I ever worked with, though they'd show anyone else their teeth if they tried to harness them. Thor shook his head fondly as he reverently placed the pieces of wood back in their box. He looked up to find Sybil staring at him in wonder. That's what they are. I can't wait to see Jarun again so I can tell her. She is obsessed with reindeer. She keeps telling me how there are hundreds of them in the national park, but she has yet to see one. Which one was Jarun? Thor asked. He hadn't paid much attention to the other people at the camp, but if they were important to Sybil, it was best that he learned as much as he could about them. We shared a tent. When she saw your cloak on my bed the night I first saw you, for a moment, I thought she was going to fight me for it. It's not reindeer hide, is it? Thor grinned. No, it's fine wool. The sort of garment you should wear outside, instead of flimsy silk. My jacket is nylon, not silk, and it's full of duck down. It's probably not as suitable for the Arctic as something like sealskin, but until yesterday, I was doing just fine with it. I guess the windproofing just didn't hold up to polar winds, is all. More words Thor did not understand. If you want a sealskin cloak, I could, he began eagerly. No. We don't steal artifacts and we don't slaughter seals. For someone who's wholly the product of my damaged brain, you sure have some archaic ideas. Ideas you can't possibly have gotten from me. What about bear fur? It's not quite as waterproof as sealskin, but it's the warmest. Sybil raised a hand to halt him. No fur or skin or killing anything. I don't even need a coat in here, now the heating's on. See? I'm taking my coat off. As if to demonstrate, she draped the garment over the back of her chair. I don't need anything heavier than a sweater inside now. She gestured toward the short moss-green tunic she now wore. It looked more like fur than wool, but Thor had never known a creature to have green fur before. What kind of creature has a pelt like this? He asked, reaching out to stroke it. She pulled away, out of reach. Do you want me to find your hammer or not? Because that's what we're here for. I'm going through all the boxes just in case I missed something, but what I really want to do is take a shower. Maybe it would be better if I did that, and came back to the lab in the morning, to look for the hammer. It has to be here, so I must have just missed it. Or maybe Jacob put the box in a different lab, or the storeroom, or maybe it got mixed up with my stuff. I don't know. I'm tired and my head hurts and, is there any chance you can wait until morning for your hammer? When she put it like that, how could he refuse? Thor inclined his head. Of course, Miss Sybil. I have my poleaxe with which to defend you. You may sleep soundly, knowing I will watch over you as you sleep. From outside the door. No poleaxes in the bedroom or the bathroom, okay? And no pretending to be a creepy vampire stalker, watching me while I sleep, either. She did seem to have a great many rules, but they were not difficult to remember. It shall be as you wish, Miss Sybil. She swallowed. And about last night? Thor grinned. Do you wish me to warm your bed again tonight? Outside of the confines of that tent, I can give you even greater pleasure. All night, if that is your wish. For a moment she looked wistful, like she was about to agree, and Thor's hopes soared. Then she shook her head. I think I'll be warm enough by myself tonight, thanks. Yeah. Thanks. She wandered out of the room, leaving her coat behind. Along with Thor's dashed hopes. He'd looked too high. Last night she'd needed his warmth and he'd happily given it to her. But now, she had no need for him as lover or protector or anything really. If only he had his hammer, and he could show her what sort of warrior he truly was. Then perhaps she might value him, if only a little. Thor sighed. He could wait until morning for that. Better that she be well rested and in a better mood, for then she'd be more appreciative of what he had to offer her. At least he hoped so, for after last night. Was it wrong to lust after the woman he was bound to protect? For he'd been able to think of nothing and no one else, and he feared one night with her had ruined him for all other women. Just the way she moaned his name at the peak of her pleasure. It was a memory he would treasure all his days, he promised himself. 25. After a shower, an amazing night's sleep in a real bed, followed by an even longer shower the next morning, Sybil was ready for work. She carefully stored each and every artifact she and Jacob had brought in yesterday, but still, she didn't find the hammer. So she went through the other labs and storerooms, checking everything. She found all sorts of things, including the X-ray machine, but Thor's hammer had vanished as if it had never existed. Luckily, she didn't have to break the news to him, because her hallucination had disappeared as readily as his hammer. Maybe she only saw him when she was really tired, or her head really hurt. She'd never had hallucinations before, and she hoped this would be the end of it. Her appointment with the doctor came and went, and she left the clinic with a clean bill of health and a medical certificate she could wave at Carl to tell him she was fit for work again. She called Jacob, who said he'd be heading back out to the expedition site in a little over a week, which gave her 8 days to read some more journal articles, wash all her clothes, and enjoy luxuries like the kitchen, the shower and a real bed while they lasted. Her only regret was that she hadn't managed to get naked with imaginary Thor before she recovered. If you were going to hallucinate a hot Norse god, at least you should sample all the goods, so to speak. It wasn't like that loincloth he'd worn had left much to the imagination. She'd even made a couple of trips up to the little shop in town, to stock up on alcohol and chocolate for Duran, as promised. On impulse, she'd bought a bottle of mead as well. It wasn't as strong as aquavit, but she figured she'd drink as much of it as she could while she was here. It wasn't like there was anything else to do at night. Tonight, she decided to take a leaf out of Tacy's book, and try to cook her own dinner, instead of reheating something from the freezer. She'd found a Norwegian recipe for something that resembled tuna morni, if you made it with cod instead of tuna, and the name roughly translated to fish gratin, so she figured she could manage it. Even better, the store had been able to provide all the ingredients, including the breadcrumbs and cheese to go on top. As she served up, she wondered what Thor would have said about it. Fish was traditional Viking food, and they'd probably had some sort of cheese, but pasta wouldn't have made it onto the menu until well after the Viking Age was over. Probably a good thing, seeing as the Norse god's hard body had definitely looked like the product of a high-protein diet, not one rich in carbs. Maybe the cheese though. Fuck. While she'd been daydreaming, the cheese sauce had trickled down the spoon and onto her hand, and it felt like it was just a shade cooler than molten lava. Sybil raced to stick her hand under some cold, running water. Miss Sybil, I hope you don't mind me asking, but, in your language, what does fuck mean? Sybil took a deep breath. That couldn't have been Thor. The doctor had said she was fine, so she couldn't possibly be hallucinating. His Norse hotness behind her, in the kitchen. Cloak hard abs, poleaxe and all. It's a coarse term for engaging in sexual intercourse, but in the present context, it's a curse word, signifying that I burned myself and am in a lot of pain, Sybil said. Which you should know, if you're a figment of my imagination. I mean, you speak and understand English, despite looking like a Viking from the first millennium, before this language even existed. Thor frowned. I believe my familiarity with your language is part of the magic that binds me to you. As I am sworn to serve you, I must understand your commands. Most of them I do, except for some words that do not seem to make sense in any language. Nylon, for example. I do not know this word. He peered at her plate. And I do not recognize this food, though it does smell of fish. I believe I would like it. Sybil's mind was starting to connect the dots, and she wasn't sure what was crazier, that this man was a hallucination, or that he wasn't. You knew things about reindeer training harness. I didn't even know anyone harnessed reindeer for anything, except maybe Santa Claus in the stories. Juran might know that, but I certainly didn't, she said. Thor nodded. Oh, reindeer are surprisingly useful and so easy to train. Much better than horses or goats, and they can live off the land, better than even we can. I mean, I trained goats to till the fields, but the other men brought back reindeer, and I have to admit, I watched with considerable envy. Sure, my seeds went into the ground sooner and I had an earlier harvest, but the next season, they had all the advantages. Mostly because Loki was driving too fast with my goats hitched up to the cart, and one tripped and broke its leg, so the cart rolled over and killed the other one, so that was the end of them, and I had to start over with a new pair. In the end, I journeyed into the mountains and captured some reindeer of my own. Juran should hear this. Juran would want to hear this. Juran, who'd seen Thor's cloak that first night, when Thor must have carried her back to her tent, because there was no way she could have gotten there otherwise. She couldn't be hallucinating him if Juran had seen his cloak. Why hadn't she realized all of this earlier? Before the night he'd climbed into her tent and pleasured her, and she'd stopped only because she knew he wasn't real. You're real, Sybil said softly, turning off the tap. She dried her hands on her pants, then reached toward Thor's face. Stubble scraped her palm as she cupped his cheek. You're Thor, and you're really here. He frowned. Yes, Miss Sybil, of course I'm real. I'm your protector, as I told you. You summoned me. He told her that, but she hadn't understood. I don't know how. I mean, I can't even order a pizza here, which is why I've been eating frozen ones. Summoning a 1,000-year-old Norse god, well, you've got to admit, it's hard to believe. She wasn't sure she wanted to believe it, even if she couldn't deny the evidence of her own eyes. 1,000 years? Truly, have I slept so long? He covered her hand with his own. No wonder your world seems so strange to me, and the words. A look of wonder lit his face. And that made no sense at all. If she'd been asleep for 1,000 years and been woken up by some PhD student, she'd be spitting chips. How can you be so calm about this? Is there some Zen school all gods get to go to? Like in Percy Jackson? Or is that just for demigods? Now he frowned. I do not know this Percy, son of Jack. Laughter bubbled up. Well, no, you wouldn't. It's a kid's book, and if you need to ask what fuck means, there's a whole lot of history and culture you'd need to catch up on. Thor stepped closer, so that barely a breath separated them. You are mistaken, Miss Sybil. I am very familiar with fucking in all its forms, and it would be my pleasure to show you. His voice was so deep, it was almost a growl. One that did wicked things to her insides. The sensible part of her brain was screaming that this was a 1,000-year-old Norse god, who could do anything he wanted to her. Her body and the lust-filled haze that was the rest of her brain, whispered that not only did his Norse hotness want to do all sorts of things to her, he'd already done some of them, and she'd wanted more ever since. Thor, she whispered. I am yours to command, Miss Sybil. What would you have me do? She swallowed. Those eyes. Glowing blue like a glacier lit from within. Me. I want you to do me. 26. His lips landed on hers, and she didn't hesitate this time. She knew this was no fever dream, and that the muscles she gripped were every bit as real as how much she ached for him. She wasn't sure how this was possible, that she'd summoned a hot Viking warrior from a previous century, but she could question that part later. Right now, the part she was most interested in was poking her in the tummy, and she wanted to feel it inside her. She wrapped her legs around his hips and climbed him like a koala. Much better, even if there was still too many clothes between them. God, but he could kiss. She almost didn't notice his hands cupping her butt, grinding her against him until she almost cried out at how good that felt. She shucked off her jacket, then made short work of the clothes she could take off until she was bare to the waist. She couldn't take her pants off without climbing down, and she didn't want to let go. Never wanted to let go. By the gods, you're beautiful. Absolutely perfect, he murmured as he pressed his lips to one nipple, then the other. Then he started to suck, and she lost all reason. Gasping, she peered up at him. I didn't even know it was possible to come without you touching me down there. I want to touch you everywhere. To see all of you as you moan my name like you did last night. To see if you truly are as beautiful in ecstasy as I imagined. Yes, yes. Anything. Everything. She was too distracted by his kisses to realize he was moving until her back hit the wall. It might have knocked the breath out of her, if she hadn't been so breathless already. Holding her in place with one hand, he tugged her pants, then her knickers off with the other. You're wetter than you were last night, he marveled. With him between her thighs, was it any wonder? If this were a romance novel, he'd have melted her underwear right off with a look. Please, Thor. Words she never thought she'd say outside of dreams. But this was no dream. She knew that for certain. Tell me what you want, Miss Sybil. Tell me, so that I can give it to you. She reached under his loincloth, for the bulge she could barely wrap her fingers around. Talk about huge. I want you to make love to me, Thor. Like last night, only more. Much more. I might be too big for you, Miss Sybil. With you still a maiden, I do not want to hurt you. Sybil had never laughed so hard in her life. I'm not a virgin. Last night wasn't even my first time sharing a swag with a guy. It might be a tight fit, especially with a man as big as you, but we'll make it work. It took her a moment to realize there were two ways he could take that. What did it matter? She should have done this with him last night. I want your cock, Thor. I want you to take me right here against this wall. Hard and fast and God, I need to feel you inside me. Now, Thor. He'd been big in her hands, but as the head of his cock slid between her thighs, she swore he'd grown even bigger. But as he buried himself to the hilt inside her, filling her completely as he rubbed against all the right spots, she forgot everything else except the hard, molten heat of him. In her. Against her. Pressing her against the wall, holding her up when her legs wouldn't hold her. "Fuck me, Thor, harder," she panted. And oh God, he did. She screamed his name, holding on for dear life as the first orgasm conquered her, stealing her breath and her heart. "Miss Sybil. Don't stop. Please don't stop. More Thor, please." The second orgasm left her trembling, barely able to cling to him as she whimpered his name. And the third. Fuck Thor. 27. Sybil trembled in his arms as he carried her to the finest bed in the building. He was still just as hard for her as he'd been in her tent last night, another of the curse's gifts, but while she begged for more, he knew she'd get cold if he kept her out in the feasting hall for too long. Of course, once he'd laid her on the bed, he paused to let his eyes drink their fill. She might be small and delicate, but his Sybil was absolutely perfect. Her eyes focused on him. "People say they want a Greek god for a hero, but a Norse god's so much better," she said dreamily. Thor had to laugh. "I'm no god. Just a man. Your man if you'll have me." Her gaze dropped to his cock. "More than just a man. Most men don't last 5 minutes, and you've been like this for 1,000 years. What are you, Thor? A foundation sacrifice. A gargoyle in your language. A protector made of living stone, sworn to keep you safe," he said. "One who's been waiting 1,000 years for you." He dropped to his knees on the bed, as she parted her thighs in welcome. He wanted to bury himself deep inside her, and forget anyone and anything else existed. Forever. Why me? He hadn't been sure at first, but now he thought he knew. "Because I am yours. Your heart and mind and beautiful body called to me, with all the power you possess, and I could not resist your call. Even a warrior like me knows when he has met his match." No, he could not resist her. He lifted her legs up over his shoulders, his cock poised to claim her hot, wet center. "Please, Thor," she begged. "So wet, so tight, so perfect." It was his turn to moan in ecstasy as he gave her everything. 28. The way every bit of her ached this morning, there was no denying Thor was real, even if she'd had a shred of doubt left. Instead, Sybil was plagued by 1,000 questions, which only Thor could answer. "So where do you go when you're not around?" Sybil asked, stabbing another piece of waffle with her fork. She'd missed toasted waffles when she was back out at sight, but that was all the more reason to get her fill of them now. "That's one of the reasons I thought you weren't real. The way you appeared and disappeared at will. The nature of the curse on me means I cannot stand in sunlight," Thor began. "So I could only appear to you at night, unlike inside this building, where the walls keep the sun out. While the sun shines, I go underground, which is where I was when you summoned me." She swallowed quickly, and took a mouthful of coffee to wash it down. "So you were in an underground cave or something?" A shadow passed across his face, like he didn't want to answer this. "No. More like a grave, filled with ice and rock and frozen soil. When you summoned me, I was able to pass through all of it to reach you." She paused to think for a moment. "So when you came to my tent on the way here, you traveled through a whole mountain to get to me? How did you hear me through all that rock?" He shook his head. "Not a whole mountain. When your donkey turned skittish at the beginning of your journey, I decided to follow you, through the earth beneath your feet. When you called, I was already close. In the rock beneath your tent, in fact." "You slept under my tent? Did you do that in camp too?" "I do not sleep. I stand watch guarding you." "No sleep at all? That sounds pretty rough. If I don't get enough sleep, I need a lot of coffee to keep functioning, but you said you didn't want any." How do you survive?" Thor chuckled, a sound that did things to her insides. Even after last night's marathon rounds of sex, she wanted more. "It is the nature of my curse. No sunlight and no sleep and no need for sustenance, but it has allowed to me to survive for what you tell me is more than 1,000 years, so that I may protect you." He'd done a lot more than just protect her last night. They'd used up all the condoms in the drawer. She'd have to head up to the store to get some more. "But who curses a god? I mean, you're the god of storms and agriculture and stuff. I'd hate to meet someone who could get the best of you. That would be seriously scary." Thor only shook his head. "I am no god. I'm merely a man, beaten in battle by an abomination that I have sworn to kill, before I was cursed by a witch. She looked like a girl from my village, not much older than my sister when the abomination killed her, but only a fool underestimates a witch. The power that girl wielded, was enough to keep me alive for 1,000 years. She must have cast some sort of spell on the abomination too, for I don't know how it could have beaten me in battle otherwise." Sybil thought for a long moment while she drained her coffee. She set the cup down carefully, then asked, "What exactly do you mean by an abomination?" "My first thought is something out of one of the games my cousin Octavia likes to play. A sort of Frankenstein's monster, a creature cobbled together from parts of different people or animals, all stitched together into a lumpy approximation of a person. A chimera of sorts." Thor nodded. "It is an unholy creature that is neither animal nor man, but a mixture of both. This thing was part wolf, part man, and I will defeat it, even if it takes another 1,000 years." Sybil stopped with a bite of waffle halfway to her mouth. "You mean the monster is still alive? Even after 1,000 years? What if it comes to the camp? What if it comes here?" She dropped her fork back on her plate, appetite lost. "If I live, then I have no doubt it does too. After all, he served the same witch who cursed me. Wherever he may be, when he shows his face, rest assured that I shall protect you. I will end him, even if it is the last thing I do before the Valkyries come for me. But in order to do that, I must find my hammer. I will need every weapon I can muster, to win the fight." She believed him, or at least she believed that he believed his own words, but she wasn't sure how to break the bad news. She'd just have to spit it out, and hope for the best. "I've looked for your hammer. Carl told me it was packed with the other artifacts, but it's definitely not here. It's not in any of the boxes, and not in the storerooms either. We must have left the box with your hammer in it at camp." Thor rose. "Then we must depart at once." Sybil shook her head. "It's not that simple. For a start, I need to wait for Jacob and his donkeys. He knows the way through the mountains and I don't. Then there's the matter of your allergy to sunlight, or whatever it is. It's morning and there's a lot of hours of daylight left before sunset, seeing it's June. But the good news is that it's one of the most important artifacts we've found this season, so wherever it is, Carl will make sure it's kept safe. Also, I realize you might not have thought about this, but if your hammer is as old as you are, then it's been buried under the ice for over 1,000 years. While that might not have done you any damage, what with the spell you're under and everything, weapons that old aren't as strong after 1,000 years as they were when they were first forged. Not to mention we've had a number of technological advancements in that time. Your hammer is a priceless artifact, far too important to be wielded as a blunt weapon in a fight, when we could go to any hardware store and pick up a sledgehammer that would probably do more damage." He looked intrigued. "You mean to buy me a new hammer? Better than my father's weapon, the one my sister wielded in the fight that earned her a place in Valhalla, and the one I swore I would use to end the creature's life who killed her?" "Oh." Sybil blew out a breath. Of course it was personal. No Bunnings-bought sledgehammer, however shiny and new, could replace an ancestral storied weapon like that. Especially when it was all wrapped up in oaths of vengeance and justice, and honor and stuff. She'd heard stories about Viking honor, and how highly they regarded it. If he'd vowed vengeance with his hammer, then his hammer had to deal the death blow, even if only symbolically. Like stabbing someone 100 times until they almost bled out, then hitting them with the hammer just before their heart stopped. Or something. Okay. How about, I buy you a new hammer to use temporarily in case the monster appears, until we find your hammer. On the way back to camp, you can return that poleaxe I know you still have around here someplace. Then when we talk to Carl and find out where your hammer is, you'll have 2 weapons to use against the monster. She paused. She had to ask. Thor sighed. You have another question, don't you, Miss Sybil? She smiled ruefully. I have a lot of questions, actually. But this time it's about the monster. I mean, 1,000 years is a long time. Most things wouldn't live that long, and even if there is a spell protecting them, extending their life, like you, the chances of them sleeping for 1,000 years and waking up at the same time seem astronomical. Especially as I've never heard of it. So what makes you think it's still out there, and that you'll finally get another shot at it? Thor paused for a moment. The shadow had returned, and he did not appear to want to tell her. Finally he said, because I can feel its presence. It awoke when I did, and the same spell binds us to the witch. She made us protectors, and while it protects her, I must protect you. Sybil shivered. Maybe she should turn up the heating in here. So the monster's coming for me? No, of course not. The monster and its mistress have no knowledge of you. How could they? You were born 1,000 years into the future, from their time. No, it is the witch who will come seeking, and what she seeks is me. Even if she finds me, even if she tortures me, I will never tell her about you. I will keep you safe. It should have sounded reassuring, and it did, but Sybil couldn't help but worry. She'd seen documentaries about all sorts of things, and she knew everyone cracked under torture eventually. Even 1,000-year-old Norse gods. I think I'll head up to the store this morning and see if I can get you that hammer, she said. As well as every box of condoms they had, so she didn't run out. Any advice on what to do if I encounter your witch or her monster on the way there? Hide, he said. If you do not challenge them or try to fight, they should not notice you, for you are no threat to them. So if you hide and do not draw their attention, you should be safe. Yep, that sounded like a good plan. The best they had, anyway. 29. Who is this? Thor asked, pointing at the back of Sybil's laptop. It was a word he still didn't understand, except that it was the name of her strange device. Her face flushed. That's Chris Hemsworth. From the Thor movies. People have told a lot of stories about you over the years, regarding you as a god, and a mighty hero. I'm sure most of them are made up, but it's possible that there's some truth in them. I mean, in the movies, Thor loses his hammer, just like you have. Twice actually, if you count when his sister broke it in Ragnarok. Thor started. Ragnarok has already happened. Sybil laughed. Well, no, not really. It was the name of the movie. What is a movie? So many words he did not understand. At least Sybil had the patience to explain them to him. Well, a movie is a story told by actors. Sort of like a play, that has been captured and recorded. She stopped. You had storytellers in your time? People who would tell tales of heroes and great deeds and gods, and when they told the stories, sometimes they used different voices for the different people in the story? Yes, of course. He'd enjoyed those as a child, though he hadn't heard many as an adult. Likely because the best storytellers had not survived Eric's attack on their village, and those who remained were not so skilled at such things. Well, if you imagine each person in the story being played by a different real person, acting out the events like they'd happened, and we have a sort of magic that can take a copy of the performance, so that anyone who has a copy can see the story, as these people portrayed it. She looked at his face. It's too much to explain, isn't it? 1,000 years of technological advancement, and even I don't know how to describe it, because I couldn't tell you how a camera works. My cousins could tell you, they've studied media at university. Thor nodded. Perhaps we could visit your family? Sybil let out a shaky laugh. Not without a plane and a passport. My family are all back home in Australia. I have not heard of this place. Is it far? Only the other side of the world. Australia's in the southern hemisphere, near the Antarctic, while we're up here near the Arctic Circle. Thor frowned. How do you reach them without sailing off the edge of the world? Sybil coughed. Fuck. 1,000 years of advancements, and I forgot about that one. How about we watch a movie, and I can show you that at least? We can save the geography lesson for afterwards. Thor nodded. Sure. 30. Afterwards, Sybil thought she probably should have found something set in Thor's time instead of the present day, but when she'd realized that the first Thor movie was the only one she'd actually downloaded onto her laptop, she figured it'd be funny to find out how Thor the man reacted to Thor the alien deity. She'd even managed to hook her laptop up to one of the meeting room projectors, to give the movie a more cinematic feel. He'd been quiet at first, just watching the opening sequence with a thoughtful look on his face, and Sybil dared to breathe again. Then the movie cut to a Viking village, in what Sybil imagined was Thor's time. Still he said nothing, and she hoped it wasn't too different to his reality. Well, except for the two comic book alien armies, of course. That couldn't possibly have happened. Maybe she should go to the kitchen, and see if there was any popcorn. She pulled her jacket back on, ready to brave the cold in the corridor. Thor snorted. The handle on that hammer is far too short. The balance on such a weapon would be terrible. You'd be more likely to drop it on your own foot, than hit someone in battle. Sybil couldn't help but agree with him. Not like your hammer at all. The handle on that is much longer, more like the axe we used to chop wood in winter back home. Something you can swing and do some serious damage with. He paused to stare at her. You have seen it. Of course I've seen it. I'm the one who pulled it out of the ice. Where I first found you, I guess. That was your hand, wasn't it? Reaching for the hammer? Of course it was. We should have kept digging, instead of stopping early for dinner as soon as we found the hammer. Then you'd still have it, and when this monster you keep talking about appears, you'd know what to do. I do know what to do, Miss Sybil, and if you say the hammer is back at your camp in the mountains, then we shall go there. Do you still wish to watch this movie? You seem distracted. She sighed and paused the film. I've seen it before. I already know what happens. Is it anything like you remember? Well, that man is certainly not me, he said, pointing at the frozen Hemsworth on the screen, surrounded by frost giants. I never marched into battle without Odin. While I did lead our men, it was never without his command to do so. We were like brothers, though he was older than me. As for Loki, well, those who did not know us thought all three of us brothers, we looked so alike. He was nothing like that man. Right. So the Norse gods were just men who looked like Hemsworths. Or better than Hemsworths, if they were all like Thor. But Sif, She was a true warrior maiden, or she would have been if she'd lived. Thor smiled fondly. Sybil had to rack her brain to remember who Sif was in the movies, as well as the mythology. Sif was your wife? Thor laughed so hard he choked. No, never. Sif had vowed never to marry, though she might have changed her mind if she met the right man. Sif was my sister. She died in battle against that abomination when Eric attacked our village, and it is to her spirit I will dedicate the blow when I send Fenrir to hell, where he belongs. Isn't Fenrir a wolf? She ventured. Half wolf, half man, and all monster. He must die, Thor said. Right. So the stories had gotten a little garbled over the centuries. But they'd been right about his hammer. So, this hammer of yours, does it have any magical powers? Sybil asked. Thor laughed. You mean does it summon lightning, or make me fly? No, it is just a hammer. A tool for hitting things. And you're not really the god of thunder, either. Thor tilted his head to the side. Well, there was that one time we had a lightning storm, and I said it would not strike the village, but it would likely strike a tree on the hill above it. Moments later, a bolt of lightning split the sky, and the tree too. My father knew how to predict the weather, and he taught me, so I always knew when a storm was coming. There was nothing magical about it, but people believed it might be, and nothing I said would persuade them otherwise. Sometimes it's nice to believe in magic, when it will help you. Not when it's a curse that turns people into monsters. My cousin Callie would say that you can't turn people into monsters. They either are, or they aren't, and curses have a way of separating monsters from the rest of us. Then again, the curses she cast weren't really magic so much as, well, downright diabolical. She filled some dick's pants with chili powder once, and changed the language on his phone to Korean, because he was rude to a waitress. He turned out to be allergic to chili, and he had a terrible rash as a result. She wondered what Callie would make of this wolf monster Thor kept talking about. She was pretty sure chili was bad for dogs too. Your cousin is a witch then? Sybil sighed. Callie would say some people call her that, but magic is just people's word for things they can't explain. She says magic doesn't really exist. So if you were to tell her about me, she would not believe you. Oh God, no. She'd tell me I was crazy, or that you were lying. That Foundation sacrifices, gargoyles like you, couldn't possibly exist. Her tone turned wistful. I'm disappointed about the flying bit though. I think that was the sweetest scene in the movie, where he flies off with her in his arms. Too late, she realized they hadn't watched that part yet, so Thor couldn't possibly know what she meant. Thor snorted. Preposterous. How anyone could believe a hammer could make a man fly. You need wings to fly. Wings like these. He rose to his feet, rolled his shoulders and… Fucking hell. Are those real? Sybil whispered. They stretched from one wall to the other, all the way up the ceiling, like someone had stuck a giant bat to his back. Must I remind you again that every part of me is real, Miss Sybil? If you wish to fly, then I shall take you. Thor held out his hand. Sybil didn't hesitate. She took it. 31. Thor burst through the roof, Sybil held tightly in his arms and spread his wings. Up, 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 until the whole town was spread beneath them. The mountains were little more than looming shadows to the west. Oh wow. That's the aurora, isn't it? I thought you couldn't see it in summer, Sybil breathed. It's so beautiful. Thor spun around. Now he could see the green waves rolling across the sky. They should not be flying in this. He angled down, back toward the roof. We should stay here where we won't be seen, he said as they landed. Is it not safe to fly during an aurora? Sybil asked. I've never heard that. I mean, thunderstorms are dangerous, but I thought auroras were just ionized particles from the solar wind, burning up in the upper atmosphere. Not even planes fly that high. So many words he did not understand. Thor just shook his head. My father told me those lights are made by the reflections off the Valkyries' armor as they ride across the Bifrost, ferrying the dead from Midgard to Valhalla, and to take care not to look too closely, lest I alert them to my presence, and they take me too early. Even after 1,000 years, it is too soon. I have not killed Fenrir yet. Sybil blinked at him. Vikings believed the northern lights were Valkyries flying through the sky with the dead? I didn't know that. Not all of my people believed the lights were dangerous. When my mother heard my father's warning, she laughed and said he was silly. The lights were nothing to be afraid of. When the Arctic foxes ran through the sky, their tails brushed the mountains and sent up sparks, which were the lights we saw. There was nothing frightening about foxes playing, Thor said. To this day, he still did not know what made the lights. Maybe both foxes and Valkyries were responsible, and he would not know which one until a Valkyrie came down to claim him. He shivered. What do your people believe? Sybil laughed softly. According to science, we're seeing particles of stardust from the sun, dancing with the air in the atmosphere until it glows. At least, that's how one of the tourist brochures described it. The tour was too expensive for me, so I figured I'd save up and try to go at the end of the year. I never realized I'd get to see the aurora out here. Thor nodded. Dancing stardust and foxes playing. There are so many stories, it is hard to know what to believe anymore. He barely believed that he was here, now, with a woman in his arms he'd waited 1,000 years for. A woman he would give his life for. Sybil squirmed around until she faced him. Well, I believe that I'm right here on the roof watching the aurora borealis with a gorgeous Viking, and I believe with a view this romantic, we should definitely be kissing right now. They started with a kiss, but soon had to go back inside the building, so that he might satisfy her completely. And by the time the sun rose, he was more than satisfied himself. He might have only known Sybil for a few days, but he was certain of one thing: she was the only woman for him, and he would do anything to keep her. 32. The camp had not changed at all since they had left, except that there was more snow on the ground. What happened to the hammer? Why didn't it make it on the supply run? Sybil asked. What do you mean? I saw Nick pack it up myself. Didn't you, Nick? Of course, said a third voice. I had to use twice as much padding, it was so heavy. I hope you brought the replacement stuff I ordered. But it wasn't there. I helped Jacob unpack everything myself, then checked all the boxes, and the hammer wasn't in any of them. It must have been left here by accident or something, Sybil insisted. You must have missed it. Because I packed it myself. Thor was done listening to Sybil arguing with the two men. The hammer hadn't been in the building where he and Sybil had stayed, which meant it must be here. If her companions hadn't seen it, then there was only one person who could have taken it. And Thor knew exactly where to find him. What is wrong with you? Loki demanded, as Thor dragged him out of the ice and pinned him against a rock. I told you I don't know where your hammer is. You must have taken it. It didn't come to the town with us, so it must be here. None of the others know where it is, so you must, Thor insisted. Did it ever occur to you that one of them might be lying? Loki inquired. Something I have never done to you, in case you've forgotten. Thor loosened his grip on Loki's throat. The man had a point. For all the pranks Loki liked to play, he had never actually lied to him. In fact, the few times Loki had taken something from him, he'd gloated loudly about how he knew where it was and Thor would never find it. So if Loki wasn't gloating now. But which one? Thor asked. Loki shoved him away and brushed off his tunic. How should I know? I don't have anything to do with them. Unlike you and your little witch. Don't think I didn't see you kissing her while the others weren't looking. Sybil. Her name is Sybil, and if you so much as look at her wrong, I will smash your face with my fist, Thor threatened. Right. You're her protector and all that. Some protector you are, without a weapon. Thor considered telling him about the poleaxe, but Sybil had insisted he put it back, so he had. She would not be pleased if he dug it up again. She'd bought him a shiny new hammer, but he'd left it with her things at the laboratory. The balance just didn't feel right, and he hadn't the heart to tell her. He needed his hammer. Then help me find it, Loki. Loki tapped his lips. Well, I might be able to help you if you help me. You see, I promised I'd help someone search people's tents, but in order to do that, someone has to distract everyone and keep them away long enough to do a thorough search. If you and your witch friend can make a distraction, I can let you know if we find anything. Thor thought for a moment. Do it now. I will hold everyone's attention for as long as I can, he said. 33. I found it. Thor burst into the tent, bottle in hand, with a beaming smile upon his face. Sybil's jaw dropped. Who in blazes are you? Nick snapped. I'm Thor. Sybil's friend. I said I'd meet her here when I found where I'd stashed the bottle of mead, and I found it. He brandished the bottle. Now, we need to warm it up properly, and we need glasses for everybody. Everybody must drink a toast to our hand fasting. As he drew close enough to lean in to kiss her cheek, he whispered, Must keep them all in here for as long as possible. Then he raised his voice to its normal volume. With Sybil's family so far away, we wanted you, as her friends and colleagues, to be part of the ceremony. Who is the leader here? Carl and Lara exchanged glances. Lara was the one who spoke first. Well, Carl is the expedition leader. But Lara is the one who makes sure everything runs smoothly, so it should really be you, Carl said. Excellent. Both of you can perform the ceremony, Thor said. Lara looked doubtful. But I've never done one before, and it's not like searching it up on the internet will be easy out here. I have seen it done many times. All you must do is bind our hands together, and ask us to say the vows. Then we are handfasted and we drink, Thor said. Lara still wasn't convinced. She looked at Sybil. Are you sure about this? Of course not. She'd never had a boyfriend for more than a few months, and this was commitment. How could this Norse god possibly want to be tied to her? I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Sybil is the kindest, loveliest woman I have ever met, and I am honored that she chose to spend a year with me. I only hope that it is time enough to convince her, let me protect and cherish her forever. He meant it. He really meant it. Sybil swallowed. Time to make shit up then and really sell this. Everyone's eyes were on her. Yes, handfasting. Thor said it's an old Viking custom. Agreeing to be together for a year. Kind of like a betrothal or living together. We decided to do it while we were in town, but he said there's usually a celebration with friends to mark the ceremony, and seeing as everyone's out here, I told him he'd have to come with me to camp if he wanted to meet everyone, so here he is. But one bottle of mead won't be enough for everyone. We should go back to my tent and find some more. She gave Thor a significant glance and jerked her head toward the door. Thor shook his head. I'm sure this will be plenty. We can get more later. Help me find the glasses, Sybil. I'll go get the rest. Be right back, Jorunn said cheerfully, slipping out the door before Sybil could stop her. Thor didn't appear to be concerned. Perhaps he just wanted everyone else to stay. Sybil would do her best. Lara sidled up to Thor. Sybil never told us she had a boyfriend back in civilization. Where'd she meet you? I went out one night, and he offered to walk me home. We got to talking and found we had a lot in common, a shared interest in Viking history and weapons, for a start. Oh, and wait until Jorunn comes back. He's worked with reindeer. But enough about us. Thor poured the mead. Tell us what you found while I've been gone. Sybil pasted a smile on her face, and did her best to say as little as possible about Thor, as the others told her about their progress on the site. Arrows, animal bones and a child's shoe seemed to be all they'd found, but Sybil kept asking for more details, drawing it out, as Thor poured the drink so slowly she might have sworn it was pitch instead of mead. Finally he was done. He pulled a length of ribbon out of a pouch strapped to his belt, and held it up. This belonged to my sister. She said if I were ever to be handfasted, I must use this ribbon for luck. A lump formed in Sybil's throat. From the way he talked about his late sister, that ribbon must be very precious to him. If he intended to use it now, he was absolutely serious about this. Could she agree to be his partner for a year? Well, the sex was already amazing. He was funny, and he wanted to protect her. They had a shared interest in Viking history, even if it wasn't exactly history to him. Besides, he'd said he was sworn to serve her, because she'd summoned him. She couldn't even begin to understand how that worked, but that meant she wasn't going to be getting rid of him anytime soon, handfasting or no handfasting. Plus, she'd never met a man more easy on the eyes. Thor handed the precious piece of ribbon to Lara. You must bind our hands with this while you, he pointed at Carl, ask us to say the vows. Once we have said the words, we must share a cup of mead, and remain bound together until everyone has toasted our handfasting. Then we may remove the ribbon, but it cannot be cut or damaged, or the same will happen to our relationship, Thor finished. So she was supposed to get tied up, get drunk, and then Thor had to help her untie herself. Nothing could possibly go wrong with that. Lara looked at the ribbon and made her decision. All right then, how do we do this? You both stand here. Thor pointed. He seized Sybil's hand in his and pulled her to his side. We shall stand here and you may begin. Oh fuck. They were definitely doing this. He held their clasped hands out, and Lara began to wrap the ribbon around them. 1,000-year-old silk, as soft as if it had been spun yesterday. It belonged in a museum for all the world to see, not around her bare hand. And yet, this ribbon was something personal and precious to Thor, so he was the one who got to decide what to do with it. For some reason she did not understand, he wanted to use it to bind them together. And she wanted, well, him obviously, but is that tight enough, or do I need to do it again? Lara asked anxiously. She'd finished wrapping the ribbon around them, and tied the ends into a little bow. That shouldn't be too hard to untie, so they wouldn't damage it. Sybil allowed herself to breathe again. That's wonderful. Thor beamed at Lara, then turned the same devastating smile on Sybil. Are you ready? He reached over to capture her other hand too. Her hand. Her breath. Her heart. Nope, her knickers had definitely melted this time. She was ready to jump him and pin him to the wall, even with all these people watching. She definitely shouldn't do that. Wait, what was it he'd asked her? Are you ready, Aston Min? My love. And the way he was looking at her, his eyes burning into her very soul. Her throat turned dry. Unable to get any words out, Sybil just nodded. Time for the vows then. Carl cleared his throat. Thor, do you agree to a hand fasting with this woman? I, Thor, Hymir's son, vow to love, honor and protect this woman and fight at her side for a year from this day. Carl seemed to relax into the role a little. Okay, Sybil, do you agree? Thor squeezed her hands, his gaze never leaving hers. He wanted this. Wanted her. And she, who was she kidding? If his Norse hotness was willing, she'd keep him forever, not just for a year. Sybil took a deep breath. I, Sybil, Cassandra's daughter, vow to love, honor and protect this man and fight at his side for a year from this day. Thor's grin couldn't have gotten any wider. But then he leaned in to kiss her, and she forgot everything else. Well, until the cheers and cries of "Get a room" got too loud to ignore. Now we must share a cup of mead, Thor said. I'll get you one, Lara said, holding out a cup. With Thor holding both her hands, Sybil wasn't sure how this was supposed to work. Luckily, Thor wasn't as clueless. He reached forward with their bound hands, so both his and her fingers curled around the cup. I'll drink first, he said, lifting the cup to his lips. A long moment passed, before he wiped his mouth with the back of his free hand and held the cup out to Sybil. Just as she suspected, he hadn't drunk more than a drop. We must finish it all, Thor said. Of course they did. Sybil drank deeply, feeling the burn as the warm mead slid down her throat. There was so much of it, and her head was swimming. But with Thor's eyes on her, so expectant and trusting, she made herself drink it all. Finally, the cup was empty. Another. A second cup was forced into her free hand, as everyone else collected a glass too. To the hand fasting of Thor and Sybil. By the time she'd finished the second cup, accepting congratulations and hugs from everyone, she was having trouble staying on her feet. Luckily, she was still tied to Thor, whose arm around her waist kept her from falling. That's when Jarun returned. I don't know where you put the rest of the mead, but I couldn't find any. Thor's grip tightened around Sybil's waist. Don't worry, we'll go find it. We'll be right back. He hurried her across the camp to her tent. The featherlight brush of something on her wrist drew her attention to the ribbon, which Thor had already untied and was now carefully storing back in its pouch. God's willing, we will use it again in a year, when we are wed. She stared at him. He meant this too. But none of this made any sense. Hand fasting, marriage, all of it. Not to mention, there isn't any more mead. I only bought the one bottle. Sybil hissed. We can't go back in there without more mead. It does not matter. In a traditional hand fasting, the couple usually leave the feast early, to engage in a more intimate celebration. The mead is merely an excuse. Well, they'd have the tent to themselves at least, with Jarun still in the mess tent. But everyone would hear them. What matters is that the search is finished, Thor finished, nodding at a shadowy figure waiting beside the tent. Sybil's blood ran cold, sobering her up almost instantly. Who are you? Sybil asked, looking the new man up and down. He was dressed like Thor, but way more wiry. Like he was Thor's younger brother, which couldn't be possible. Thor had said he had no family left. Loki, Thor growled in warning. The man closed his eyes and sighed. Your betrothed said if I so much as looked at you wrong, he would punch me. As I don't want to offend, here. He shoved something into her hands. We didn't find a hammer, but we did find this. I hope it means more to you than it does to me. He stalked off into the darkness. Sybil looked down. Why am I holding a sat phone? She brought it closer to her headlamp. This isn't Lara's one. It's smaller. She pressed a button and the screen lit up. Looks like someone's been taking pictures of the waste barrels. Why anyone would do that, she had no idea. Maybe it was a mistake, and there were better pictures further along. A whole gallery of barrels and, wait, is that your hammer? It looks like the handle. She peered closer. It went in one of the waste barrels to keep it safe, because it was too big for any of the boxes. We have to go back to the lab before the waste company comes to dispose of them. If only Jacob hadn't already left. We don't need donkeys to get there. I can fly you over the mountains before morning if we leave now, Thor said. I can't just leave, she began, but she also couldn't risk sending that precious hammer and her PhD to the nearest landfill either. I'll tell Carl you're an experienced hiker, and that we left something at the lab, so we have to go back and get it. I'll tell him we'll catch up with Jacob and travel the rest of the way with him. 34. Quick, get inside before the sun's up, Sybil said, pushing Thor through the door before following him into the cramped vestibule. She was half dead on her feet after flying all night with Thor, but he had to be exhausted, seeing as he'd been the one actually doing the flying, while she'd just been along for the ride. We need to make sure the hammer's here, he said. She sighed. All right, I'll go check to see if the waste barrels are still here. We can check the contents in the morning. She lurched across the yard to the shed, where an open padlock dangled from the door. She tugged it out of the bolt, and opened the door. It took her a lot of fumbling before she managed to turn on her headlamp, but as the beam played over the stacked barrels, she dared to breathe again. The hammer was here. It had to be. Sybil closed the door and clicked the padlock into place. She returned to the lab building, where she found Thor sitting expectantly in the cafeteria. The barrels are all still here. No one's come to pick them up yet. We can check them tonight. But if my hammer's there, he began eagerly. She set a hand on his chest, before almost toppling over onto him. I need to sleep, Thor. I'm no help to you like this, and you can't go out in the sun, remember? So if you're stuck here until sunset, the least you can do is let me sleep until we can go out there together. I promise I'll help you get your hammer back. I'm just, not an immortal Viking gargoyle Norse god. Then the world sort of slid sideways. Luckily, Thor caught her before she hit the floor. Of course, Miss Sybil. 35. It was past lunchtime when Sybil finally woke up. Thor was nowhere to be seen, but as it was still daylight outside, she figured he'd reappear by the time the sun went down. She considered searching through the barrels herself until she found his hammer, but she'd barely been able to lift the hammer when they'd first found it, and now it was packed in a barrel with who knew how much padding and other stuff to protect it. She'd definitely need Thor's help to get it out. Not to mention there were a lot of barrels in there, which she'd need help moving them until she found the right one. Poor Thor. It must really suck not being able to go out in the sun. To know his hammer was so close, and yet still out of reach for a few more hours. Maybe there was a way to break the curse. Not that she knew much about witchcraft or magic, but she knew someone who did. Unfortunately, Callie wasn't answering her phone. Sybil tried 3 times but still no answer. Maybe Callie was in a lecture, with her phone on silent. She'd try again later. Next, she called Katina. As a fellow archaeologist, Katina had worked on a few different sites, like Sybil, but her godmother Maria was a legend in the archaeology community, who'd worked all over the world. If anyone had come across gargoyles or foundation sacrifices on a dig, it was Maria. Of course, she didn't have Katina's number in her phone. It should be in her email somewhere though. Her email inbox was overflowing. Even after Sybil had deleted all the spam, there were still heaps to skim through. A search for Katina's name brought up an email from Callie, so Sybil clicked on it. And nearly lost it laughing. A Mothman? Seriously? It wasn't as hot as digging up a Norse god, or near enough, but… Sybil clicked on the video link. It kind of looked like a guy in a Batman suit with wings, but if she squinted, he also looked a little like Thor. Not that she'd ever seen Thor dance. Did Vikings dance? Then again, what were the chances of one of her friends finding a gargoyle at the same time that she had? She had to call Katina. On the third email, she hit pay dirt, Katina's number, at the bottom of her email signature. Unlike Callie, Katina answered on the first ring. "Hello," she ventured. "Kat? It's so good to hear your voice." A long pause. "Is that Sybil?" "That's me. Fresh from the frozen wastes of the Arctic, back in civilization for a little while before they send me back to site with the next load of supplies." Sybil found herself babbling about life in camp, and how much of a dick Saint Nick was, though everyone else was wonderful. The problem was, she wasn't sure how to shift the subject around to Thor, or the Mothman. Finally, she paused to take a breath. "It sounds amazing," Katina admitted. "Well, now or never. I haven't even told you the best part. I've found a 1,000-year-old Viking god, and is amazing in bed." "Nope. Somehow unearthed a cursed Viking warrior, and I want to know what you know about curses." "Hell no. Heard you got captured by a paranormal creature, and I want to compare notes." "Definitely not." Sybil chickened out. I've met someone, and I'll probably be staying for another season to see what else we can find. I'm learning so much." Silence. Katina never had been much of a gossip. Not like the others. Callie would be asking how big Thor's dick was by now. Enormous and so addictive. Sybil swallowed. "How about you? Have you decided on a PhD project yet, or did Alethea talk you into joining her company as a consultant instead?" Katina blew out a breath that sounded awfully frustrated. "I'm finalizing my project proposal this week. I definitely want to do my PhD next year, and no, Alethea hadn't managed to talk me into digging up dead bodies with her. Did you know their latest project was digging up an old colonial cemetery?" Sybil imagined Katina shuddering. She was a great archaeologist, but she didn't want anything to do with dead bodies. Sybil smothered a laugh. Good thing Katina wasn't here in Norway. "Well, you know that's the holy grail up here. Dead bodies. Frozen ones. They're hoping to find another ice mummy, like Otzi. My friend says we have a good chance of finding one too, because it was an ancient trading and raiding route. Thor knows so much about Viking history." Oops. She probably shouldn't have mentioned Thor. Well, too late now. She should change the subject quickly. "Anyway, what about you? Have you met anyone yet? And what's this I hear about you having a major moth problem?" I tried to watch the video, but I only saw a few seconds of his moves before the video froze. The internet connection here keeps dropping out. It might feel like civilization after the dig site, but it's really just a few storage rooms and a lab, on the outskirts of a tiny town. "So, are you going to tell me about him?" More silence. Sybil wondered if the call had dropped out. Finally Katina said, "There's nothing to tell, really. Just a silly video of a guy in a coat, they're making out to be a monster. Is not, honestly. He's the sweetest, most chivalrous guy I've ever met. He's…" Another pause. "We're just friends," she finished. Sybil wasn't buying that for a second. "Aha. Sure. Just like me and Thor. I want to know where he learned to dance like that. I expect to meet him when I get home. Or we can video call when we're done. I want to hear every single detail. Miss Sybil? It's sunset. Sybil's mind went blank at the sight of Thor in little more than his short kilt, standing in the doorway. She wanted to take him back to bed, and ravish him. But first, they needed to find his missing hammer. She had promised. Sorry, Cat, I have to go. Thor said one of the artifacts is missing, and it's really important. Talk later. Bye. She ended the call and gave Thor her full attention. Right. Let's get suited up so we can find your hammer. Thor frowned. Suited up? What does that mean? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not going through barrels of waste without my biohazard suit on. They're in the cupboard outside the necropsy lab, where we keep all the bones. At Thor's look of complete and utter confusion, she took pity on him. Translation magic couldn't keep up with technology. Here, I'll show you. I'm sure there'll be a suit in your size. Most of the men on the expedition were Viking-sized, so something had to fit him. But when she opened the cupboard, all the hooks were empty except for 3, the one for Sybil's suit, alongside the ones for Duran and Freya, the lab manager. Duran's suit was long enough, but there was no way it was wide enough for Thor's shoulders. Freya's one though, that looked like it had been made for a tall woman with distinctive curves. It was a bit of a squeeze, but Thor managed to get into Freya's suit, even if he did chunter under his breath a bit, as he kept adjusting it. Are you sure this is necessary? He asked. Now he didn't look like his Norse hotness so much as a giant, white frowning marshmallow man. Sybil ducked her head to hide her smile as she fastened the seals on her own suit. Hers wasn't comfortable either, but at least hers was custom-made to her measurements. You want your hammer back, don't you? He gave a curt nod. Think of it as armor for going into battle, Sybil suggested. Armor that would help block out the smell, she thought but didn't say. Women's clothing is not armor. Women are to be protected. They should not have to fight, Thor grumbled. Scratch the man and reveal the inner misogynist. So much about fighting at each other's side when they got handfasted. Sybil just shook her head. Didn't you say your sister fought with that hammer, and is now in Valhalla? Isn't that place just for warriors? Thor frowned. She should not have had to fight. I should have been there to protect her when they came. Maybe it wasn't so much misogyny as guilt. 1,000 years was a long time to carry such a burden. Didn't you also say the same monster who killed her also defeated you? Even if you'd been there for the initial attack, could you have saved her? I would have tried, he said grudgingly. At least I would have died with honor, defending her. Survivor's guilt. Sybil had heard about this one. Well, you're not dead yet, so you still have a chance at that glorious death in battle. Do you want your hammer back for it, or not? I will not go into battle against the abomination without it, he said. I owe her that much. Right. So, are you ready to march into battle to find it then? Another curt nod. Even if I must dress like a woman to do it. Sybil had to laugh. You know men wear suits like this too. When mine arrived, Carl said he was due to order a new one. At least these ones are white. The ones they're using in some parts of the world for the pandemic are bright orange. Thor still didn't look convinced, but he did look ready to go, so Sybil led the way out to the barrel shed. The number of barrels had doubled while she'd slept. Evidently Jacob had brought in another load. Those ones are new. The ones we want are the row against the wall. Can you help me move them out of the way so we can reach them? Thor didn't so much help as move them all, as most of them were too heavy for her to budge. Having a Norse god around was definitely useful. Right. So we just need to open these and check what's inside. If you see anything that looks like the padding in that picture, give a shout, Sybil said, looking for something to use to pry the barrels open. There were a couple of crowbars in the corner, but she settled for a particularly chunky screwdriver. The first one she pried open looked to be filled with dirty ice and slush. She quickly closed that back up again, before the smell seeped out. The next two were filled with what looked like food scraps and rubbish from the mess tent. Wow, we sure do eat a lot of fish, she said, moving on to the next barrel. Hey, this one has a letter on it. It looks sort of like a P or maybe a D, she said. Even through the bulky suits, she could feel Thor looming over her. It looks like my mark, which is also the mark for danger. It's the rune Thursday. But I did not make this mark. So, do you think we should open it? If someone took the effort to mark this barrel as dangerous, maybe we should leave this one. Did you not say these silly suits would protect us like armor? You may stand back, but I will open it. Danger or not, this cask bears my mark, so it follows that what it contains is mine. Yet as Thor pried at the lid with his crowbar, Sybil couldn't make herself stand back. It wasn't like she expected to find anything worse than she'd already seen today. He lifted the lid, and Sybil's breath caught in her throat at the sight of the same sort of wadding that filled the boxes in the lab. This was it. It had to be. He tore into the wadding like a toddler opening a birthday present. The tinkle of something small and metallic hitting the concrete rang out. Wait, stop, she said, darting forward to catch the cascade. It wasn't one item, but more than a dozen of what looked like brooches and coins, stuff she'd never seen before. Where did all this come from? She asked, picking up a large golden piece as big as the palm of her hand. When she turned it over, she realized it was just the setting that was gold, framing a huge piece of amber that seemed to glow. Thor growled. This belonged to Odin's wife. A wedding gift from her family. From the day she died, he never took it off. Maybe someone put it in here to keep it safe, Sybil suggested, but the words felt wrong. Everything in the boxes had been carefully packed for the journey across the mountains, and she'd made sure they were stored safely in the lab. Someone had hidden the jewels here. She gathered them all up and wrapped them carefully in the piece of wadding they'd fallen from, then placed the bundle on top of one of the new barrels. Okay, now you can remove more of the padding, but carefully, in case there's other artifacts in there. Thor reached into the barrel, but this time the bundle he pulled out was a big one. The big one. If this wasn't Thor's hammer, Sybil would eat nothing but raw herring for the rest of the summer. He laid his bundle across the top of two barrels, and began to unwrap it with far more care. Sybil couldn't smother her gasp as the final layer came away. The hammerhead shone like modern steel, or silver at the very least. It didn't look 1,000 years old, it looked brand new. The leather-wrapped handle looked like it had seen some use, though it didn't look particularly worn. Like it was a ceremonial weapon, only used for the most important of occasions. Thor flexed his gloved hands, then wrapped them around the hammer's handle. In one mighty stroke he smashed the empty barrel flat, sending an explosion of paperwork flying in all directions. How dare you try to conceal my hammer from me, he roared, raising the hammer to pulverize the debris. Sybil rushed forward to stop him. If he destroyed any of the other barrels, things could get very messy, very quickly. Besides, those papers could be important. Stop. You can't go smashing things indiscriminately like that. I know you're happy to have your hammer back. Let's take it inside so we can get out of these awful suits, and I can put those other artifacts away. Oh, and will you help me gather up these papers? While Thor hefted the hammer proudly over his shoulder, Sybil tucked the bundle of jewelry and papers under her arm. It wasn't until she'd changed out of her suit and laid her finds out on one of the lab tables that she realized the significance of her little hoard. These are the artifact tags for all of these things, including your hammer. Quickly, she matched each tag to the piece it belonged to, before packing everything into one of the empty boxes. That left only one sheet, the one for Thor's hammer. "I do not like hazmat suits," Thor announced as he sauntered into the lab, still holding his hammer. He'd left his cloak behind, so there was plenty of bare skin to hold her gaze between his kilt and boots and shoulder guards. A normal man should be wearing a shirt and a whole lot more warm clothing, but she knew from experience that if she pressed a hand to Thor's chest, he'd be every bit as warm as she was, with no need to cover up. Nothing beat a Norse god. "Miss Sybil, I owe you a great deal for helping me find my hammer. How would you like me to show my gratitude?" Her mouth went dry. Was it wrong to ask him to pose naked for her with just his hammer? Just one photo. Or maybe two, in case one pose looked hotter than the other. Or... His eyes glinted with mischief. "I believe we should retire to your bedchamber, for what you have in mind." Moments later, the hammer lay forgotten on the desk, as Thor pounded her pussy with a far more pleasurable weapon, and she cried out for joy. Who needed pictures when she had him? 36. The next morning, Sybil's legs ached in places they'd never done before. She probably shouldn't have ridden him so hard, but when he'd begged her to take a turn on top, they'd both enjoyed it so much that he'd taken hold of her hips to prolong their shared pleasure, and... Fuck, he was an absolute god in bed. For all that he said he was just a man. Her poor pussy would never want a mortal man again, after Thor. Unless there was a way to break the curse, so Thor could be a normal man again. Well, hardly normal, but... She tried calling Callie again but still got no answer. So she called Tacy instead. May as well call all her cousins while she had a moment. It would be lovely to catch up and find out what they were doing. "Hello?" Tacy sounded suspicious. "Tacy? Is that you? It's Sybil." She heard a chorus of cries at that, like Tacy wasn't alone. "Who's there?" Sybil asked. "I have you on speaker because I'm home with Rory, Octavia, Alethea, Callie and Rochelle." Jackpot. Not that she could say much in front of 5-year-old Rory, but... Oh, perfect. So I can tell all of you, I met someone up here, a real Viking, so I'm staying for another season so we can work on this dig together. We've already found so much, but we're hoping for an ice mummy like Otzi. Seeing as the borders are still closed, it's probably the best place for me, until it's safe to come home. We're pretty isolated. So we've missed the worst of the pandemic in the big cities so far. Even now I'm in civilization, it's a tiny little town, and half of it's taken up by our research labs. Can you believe there's still snow on the ground in summer? It was like that in Scotland sometimes, someone said. A male voice Sybil didn't recognize. Who was that? Who else is there? Has one of you finally gotten a boyfriend? Sybil demanded. Well, Octavia's engaged, and her and Callie are considering a double wedding when the weather gets warmer and the restrictions ease, Tacy said. Sybil let out a squeal. What? Oh, I want to be there. Callie and Octavia, getting married? And here I thought you or Alethea would be first. Hell, she should tell them about getting handfasted to Thor. But how did you tell your family something like that? Luckily, Alethea got in first. What about you? Did you say you'd met someone in the Arctic? Is he hot? Sybil swallowed. Didn't I tell you? Oh, you have to meet Thor. He's a real live Viking, just like they made them 1,000 years ago. I'd take him over a Hemsworth any day, because he's the real deal. Oh, did you say Callie's there? I'm here. Callie called, sounding like she was in the bottom of a well, or at least not that close to the phone. Sybil took a deep breath. Hey, in all your research on ancient spells and stuff, did you ever run into mentions about foundation sacrifices or gargoyles? Silence. Shit. They'd never believe her if she told them the truth about Thor, not if she'd shocked them with just a mention of what he was. She should never have called them. As if by magic, her phone beeped with a message. Oh, wait, I've just got an emergency message coming through, Sybil said, swiping across to see what she'd been sent. The message was from Lara's satellite phone. Her jaw dropped, and it took her a long moment before she could speak again. We were supposed to ship out in a week, with the next supply run, but they've found something in the glacier that needs to be helicoptered to the lab right away, which means I need to get out to the helipad if I want a ride. It might be a body buried in the ice, a real live Viking. The moment the words left her lips, she regretted them. Of course the ice mummy they'd found couldn't possibly be alive. He wasn't Thor. She hurried to end the call, so she could tell Thor they were headed back to camp. 37. If they have found someone, it must be Odin, Thor said when Sybil told him the news. Sybil's mind blanked for a moment. You mean Odin? The father of all the Norse gods, rides an 8-legged horse, traded his eye for wisdom, Odin? Thor laughed. I mean the leader of our village, Odin. He's no more a god than I am. But if his wife's brooch was there, then he could not have been far. If your people have found his body, then he was buried with full honors, and his soul likely resides in Valhalla, as was his due. He looked thoughtful for a moment. Wherever did you hear that about Sleipnir? Sleipnir? Oh, you mean his horse? It's part of the Norse myths. Odin had a horse that could travel with unusual swiftness, on its 8 legs. There are also rumors that Loki was its mother. Even Sybil found that one hard to believe. There were trans people in the present, but she couldn't imagine things would have been the same 1,000 years ago. Hormone treatments and surgery would have been non-existent, for a start. Of all the details to survive for 1,000 years, Loki was Sleipnir's mother, or at least the horse thought so. He found the foal beside its dead mother, and he raised it. The creature did not have any more than the normal number of legs, but he did run uncommonly fast. Loki was never much of a rider, and after the beast tossed him off a couple of times, Loki gave him to Odin. He never bucked Odin off, that's for sure. Sybil could only shake her head, as they walked up to the reception desk at the tiny airport that served the town. You are here for the helicopter, yes? The woman behind the desk asked. Yes. Flying across the mountains to the archaeology dig for the university, Sybil said. She pointed to herself and Thor. Both of us. She expected the woman to protest, but she just shot Thor an admiring glance and nodded. At least he'd bundled the hammer up in his cloak, instead of carrying the weapon openly. The pilot is ready to take off when you are. Do you have any luggage? Sybil shook her head. She'd left everything back at camp. I tell him you are ready to go then? All too soon, they'd climbed aboard the helicopter, which looked like it could easily take a dozen more passengers than just the two of them. The only time Sybil had seen helicopters this big was up in Broome and the Pilbara, ferrying staff out to the offshore oil and gas rigs. More than big enough to take an ice-encrusted body back to the lab, even if he'd been as big as Thor in life. Sybil had to help Thor with his safety harness, because he'd never seen anything like it before. It took her a moment to work out how to fasten her own, but the pilot was too busy doing his pre-flight checks to care much about his passengers. Also, it turned out he was waiting for a carton of French champagne that Carl had ordered. He'd been waiting a long time to find his Iceman, and now he'd finally found one. Carl evidently wanted to celebrate. The pilot handed out headphones, like they did on charter flights back home. Sybil considered making a joke about the in-flight movie, until she realized Thor didn't know what to do with his headphones, and she needed to help him before the pilot noticed anything strange about his passengers. Takeoff was phenomenal. She'd never been in a helicopter before, and there was so much more to see outside than through the tiny porthole windows on a plane. In fact, she was the one behaving like a first-time tourist, while Thor just sat back with a smile on his face, watching her. That's when she realized he was used to flying, what with having wings and all. Bloody smug Norse hotness. The flight was over far too soon, as the twinkling lights of the camp came into view, beside the temporary helipad they'd created with a ring of lights. Just like they did at remote site airstrips back home. Only at home the lights weren't reflected by ice and snow. The pilot shooed them out of his helicopter, depositing the box of champagne in Thor's arms, before turning to greet the rest of the expedition team. 4 men, it was too dark to see their faces, carried what Sybil could only describe as a body bag. It evidently took all 4 of them to lift it into the helicopter, and secure it to the middle of the cabin, between the rows of seats. Then they returned for a second body bag, and laid it beside the first. Then they all climbed out, except for the pilot, and the helicopter flew off with its precious cargo. "Let's take this to the mess tent," Carl said, taking the box from Thor. Sybil was surprised Carl hadn't gone with the ice mummy. It was his dream find, after all. Lara must have thought the same thing, because when they trooped into the mess tent she said, "What? Not flying back to civilization with your baby, to make sure they take care of him?" Carl just laughed. "Freya's on her way up to the lab right now. She'll take the delivery." He couldn't be in better hands. She is a doctor after all. Lara had already set out cups, the same ones they'd used for the mead, so Carl popped open the first bottle and started pouring. When everyone had a glass, he raised his. "To Odin." They all repeated the toast, and drank. Sybil searched the tent for Thor, but he'd vanished. How did they know it was Odin then, if Thor hadn't told them? And who was in the second body bag? She sidled up to Carl. "Why are you calling him Odin? Did he have a name badge on him? Like Thor had worn the suit with Freya's name badge on it last night." Carl laughed. "No. He was still too deep in the ice for us to see much of him, but he had a patch over one eye and a spear in his hand, so it seemed a good enough name for an important man. I'm sure the university will name him properly, so it doesn't matter what we call him. Ah, but your glass is empty. Let me get you more champagne. Not only will you have the hammer to research, but an entire Viking grave to investigate for your PhD. Never have we had such a successful season, and it's not even halfway through. You and Jarun are our lucky charms." "You mean Jarun found the ice mummy?" Sybil shouldn't have been so surprised. It could have been any of them, really, seeing as they walked the grid in a search pattern. Better Jarun than Saint Nick. She glanced around. Jarun was clinking glasses with Lara, looking like they were intent on some sort of drinking game, while the 3 men she couldn't tell apart cheered them on. Carl beamed like a Christmas lantern. "Where's Nick?" she blurted out. A tiny crease appeared in Carl's forehead. "Ah, there was a terrible accident. Nick went walking outside the camp at night, and was attacked by an animal. He was terribly injured, and we had to send him to hospital in the helicopter." The second body bag. "He's dead?" Sybil cried. She might not have liked him, but he didn't deserve to die just for being an asshole. The crease vanished. No. He is alive, but injured. The animal attack. He will recover. Carl managed a rueful smile. If he had not been injured, we might never have found the Iceman. We shall save a bottle for Nick, I think. He hurried off to get to the champagne, before it was all gone. 38. Thor left Sybil and her friends merrily drinking in the feasting tent, and went to find Loki. I see you found your hammer. Of course, Loki was the one to find him, appearing in the darkness like he'd sprung out of the ice. Perhaps he had. I did. Now I am ready to defend Sybil from all threats, even if the witch and her wolf return. Thor squinted at him. Is it true that they have found Odin's grave? What do you mean his grave? He was cursed right along with us. You don't get a grave until you're dead. Do you feel dead? Thor gaped. Odin is alive? Of course is alive. Just frozen in the ice. I wonder what he'll do when he wakes up. Loki grinned, mischief lighting his eyes. But they are going to do tests on him. Examine him. Sybil said they will even scan him. That is what they do to dead bodies they find in the ice, so they can learn more about history. They can't do that if he is alive. Actually, Thor wasn't sure what most of those things were, but Sybil had talked about them non-stop with a great deal of excitement, as she spoke of doing the same things to his hammer. Loki's grin only widened. I'm sure he'll tell them. Thor shook his head. But this is an important discovery to Sybil and her friends. They wish to learn about the past, and they have been looking for a body to conduct these tests on. She will be terribly disappointed, and so will the others. Loki shrugged. They'll get over it. There are other bodies beneath the ice. Scores of them, and the rest of them are actually dead. What do you think happened to the rest of our warriors? Only you, me and Odin were cursed. The others just died and were buried beside Odin. They made him stand and watch before they cursed him. All of them just thrown into a pit, with all their weapons all jumbled up together. I can just imagine them all trying to grab their weapons, all at the same time, when the Valkyries came to claim them. Thor strode toward the sounds of merriment. Then we must tell the others and guide them to the spot where they can find these bodies. Before they are disappointed by finding out Odin is not dead. Loki held up his hands. Oh, you're on your own on that one. You're the one sworn to serve. I don't see the need to be helpful at all. Of course he did not. Loki liked chaos too much for that. But that didn't stop Thor. He swept into the tent, surprising all of them. Is it true? You found an important warrior. The oldest man among them, the one who'd helped with the handfasting, who now stood beside Sybil with a drink in his hand, nodded. Definitely an important man. A very ornate burial, from what we can see. Then you must look very carefully at the soil surrounding his grave. His men would have fought beside him, and they would have been buried nearby, for a leader rarely dies alone. I have seen a number of such graveyards, and the pattern is always the same. Thor took a sheet of paper and one of the pencils Sybil liked to use, and began to draw. The leader would be here and his men. He sketched them in quickly, based on what Loki had told him of their whereabouts. Can you show me where you found Odin? Carl slapped Thor on the back. Of course. You must come and see. Grabbing an open bottle which he tucked under his arm, he led the way out of the tent. Sybil, everyone, you should come too, so we can work out where to survey tomorrow. Only when they went outside, they found it was already snowing. Back inside. When this storm blows over, then we will search for Odin's army, Carl shouted, brandishing his bottle. 39. The snow didn't let up for a week, so much for it being summer. No one was allowed to leave camp until the skies cleared, and while the others had endured this once already while Sybil was down in the labs with Thor, this was her first time being confined to camp, and she hoped it never happened again. The batteries on everyone's devices started to run down on the second day, and between the snow and the wall-to-wall cloud cover, the solar panels weren't much use for recharging anything. The gas cookers still worked, so they still had hot food and coffee, but that was probably the only bright spot in the whole week. Well, that and Geron's bright idea to teach Thor to play poker. He grasped the rules readily enough, but the man had no concept of a poker face, and the better he learned to play, the easier it became to read his hand from his expression. It was probably a good thing they hadn't thrown gambling into the mix, or Geron would have robbed him blind. Poor Thor just couldn't bluff. On the evening of the 8th day, Geron had endured an unusually bad losing streak, which meant it was her turn to go to the mess tent to check on dinner. Geron returned quicker than usual. "I have good news and bad news," she announced. Sybil knew what she wanted first. "What's the bad news?" Geron wrinkled her nose. "One of the guys was in charge of dinner, and he decided we're having smoked herring wraps with sauerkraut." Sybil felt bile rise up in her throat at the thought. What with being snowed in and having the supply run delayed as a result, everyone had been eating more, so they were down to the foods she liked least, and they'd had too much smoked herring to start with. "Don't you want to hear the good news?" Geron asked. Sybil shook her head. "Nothing's good enough to make up for that." "You don't know that," Geron said. "What is it then?" Geron looked smug. "It stopped snowing. If the skies stay clear, we might be allowed to start surveying again tomorrow." Thor perked up. "Let me look." He made his way to the tent flap and stuck his head through. He just stayed there for a long moment before he said, "She's right. There's a warm wind coming in from the ocean. It should blow this storm to the other side of the mountains, and melt all the snowfall in a matter of days." "How would you know? Did you already sneak a look at the forecast while I was gone?" Geron asked. Thor just shrugged. "My father taught me about the weather, and I'm never wrong." The god of thunder, he wasn't, but he was as good a weather forecaster as whatever app Lara was using. By morning the snow had turned to slush, and the whole camp was a muddy miasma. By evening Thor's promised warm wind had come to call, and within a day it was like the snowstorm had never happened. At dinner, Carl raised his bowl of baked beans in a toast. "Tomorrow we resume our survey and our search for Odin's army," he said. He could have said they were looking for Odin's camp latrine pit, and they still would have cheered. Everyone else was too happy to be allowed out of camp to argue. 40. By day's end, Sybil's feet hurt from crunching over rocks, and if she had to lean over one more time to examine something promising that turned out to be nothing more than a freeze-dried weed, she might scream. There had been some small finds in the area surrounding the pit they were all calling Odin's grave, but nothing like the dead army Thor had promised. If she didn't know him so well, she'd have sworn he was lying about the other graves, but Thor couldn't even bluff at poker. If he said there was a whole company of ice mummies to be found, then the bodies were here somewhere. "Who's on dinner duty tonight?" Carl asked. "I am with Geron," Sybil said. She'd never been so grateful to be assigned to the kitchen in her life. "You two head back to camp then, and the rest of us will finish this last search pattern before it's too dark to see," Carl said. Sybil shouldered her daypack and trudged back to camp, hearing the scrunch of Geron's tired steps not far behind her. "What do we have left?" Sybil asked as Geron peered into the stacked boxes that were their makeshift pantry. "Enough smoked herring to choke a whole pack of polar bears, and a box of dehydrated curry and rice." Sybil perked up. "How did we all miss that?" Jurun shrugged. We're in Norway, not Australia. They're fans of Arctic fish, not sauce that'll blow your socks off. Sybil pulled out an armload of dehydrated meal packs and hugged them to her chest. I don't know about you, but I could murder a curry, she quipped. Jurun grinned. Pratchett, right? Academic humor at its best. Curry it is then. They both bustled about, emptying the curry packets into one pot, and the rice into another. By the time they were ready to dish up, it was full dark outside, but none of the others had returned. Should I go get them and tell them dinner's ready? Sybil asked, looking longingly at the cooker. After eating fish for almost a week, the chicken curry smelled amazing. They know the way back to camp. They'll be fine, Jurun said. We should serve up while it's still hot. Let the others heat up leftovers if they're late. After a week of sitting down to meals with everyone confined to camp, having the two of them at the table felt strange. Sybil had almost finished her dinner when she heard the squeal of someone unzipping the tent door. About time. Dinner's probably cold by now, she said over her shoulder. She pointed in the direction of the gas cookers. Help yourself. I have no need for sustenance. I came see that you are safe, Thor said. Jurun rose, dirty dishes in hand. Well, that's my cue to leave. See you back in our tent when you two are done? She dropped her plate and cutlery into the washing-up tub and ducked outside. I'm a perfectly adequate cook, and I didn't cut or burn myself once tonight, Sybil boasted. That is good, Thor said, peering out the tent flap. Only now did she realize he held his hammer with both hands, as if ready to strike. A chill tiptoed across her heart. Thor, what's out there? The witch and her protector. They came through the mountain pass just after the sun set, as your companions were leaving. Carl challenged them. He told them they were not allowed to be here, as it is a protected archaeological site. Wow. For a man who didn't look entirely certain about what that meant, he managed to pronounce it pretty well. But if what Thor had said was true, then this witch and her monster had cursed and beaten him in the past. If they were even slightly like Thor, they would not appreciate Carl giving them orders. What happened? Is everyone okay? Thor shook his head. I do not know. She called to me, tried to summon me as you did. I felt the call in my heart, trying to pull me away from you, but I did not answer. I will not answer. I am not hers to command. I am handfasted to you. He gripped his hammer even tighter than before, as though he feared this witch might try to take it from him. She shall not have you. I will protect you. I will finally end the abomination that took my sister's life, and then I will force the witch to release me from this curse. It sounded like a really good plan. One that might even work, except... Didn't you say the monster nearly killed you last time? Sybil ventured. Yes, but I have my hammer, and I know what I face this time. I will not be taken by surprise again. Even after 1,000 years, the male ego was still as fragile as ever. Thor. How did one tell a Norse god he wasn't good enough to beat a monster? Not that Sybil had ever seen this monster, but she did know he'd beaten Thor once. That was recommendation enough to avoid it forever. Thor, we must go. The second man to burst into the tent looked like a wirier, younger version of Thor. The man who'd handed her the sat phone the other night, Sybil realized. Not now, Loki. Astrid and Fenrir are here. We cannot leave until I have vanquished them both, Thor snarled. He brandished the hammer at his imaginary foes. Well, Sybil hoped they were imaginary, or at least not close enough for combat. The mess tent wouldn't survive long if Thor meant to fight them here. You're a fool if you stay, Thor. Already I can feel the call. I've learned to resist, but it's only a matter of time before you answer. She will have you fighting for her, not against her, if you stay. Come with me. Together, we will wake Odin, and the three of us will stand a far better chance against the witch and her pet. Together, we can beat them. Divided, we will fall, just as we did before. Sybil was inclined to agree with him. Then again, Thor had called him Loki, which meant he was a slippery trickster, every bit as devious as the movie character, if the myths were to be believed. Hell, wasn't he supposed to be Fenrir's father? A good father would do almost anything to save his son. What about Sybil? I can't just leave her here at the witch's mercy, Thor said. Loki glanced at Sybil, then just as quickly dismissed her. The witch won't want any of these scholars. She wants warriors. She wants us. If we go to find Odin, she and her monster will come for us. We can't let her get to Odin first, especially if he still slumbers. We must wake him and take a stand together. Thor's eyes darted from Sybil to Loki, as though he could not decide who to listen to. Not that Sybil had much to say on the matter. I don't know much about fighting, but what I do know is that numbers matter. And strategy. If you stand a better chance of winning with allies, then you shouldn't fight alone. Loki nodded, looking surprised. She's wise, your little witch. You should listen to her. Sybil set her hands on her hips. What did you just call me? She might be small, but no way was she letting some asshole she didn't know call her a witch. Loki smiled. I called you wise. It means clever, an important quality in a scholar. Now, if Thor were even 1/10 as wise as you, he'd see the wisdom of my advice, and we'd be halfway to Odin by now. Are you coming, brother, or are you determined to get yourself and your betrothed killed? Still Thor was torn. But Sybil had already decided. Go with him. If I see your witch, I'll point her in the right direction of where to find you. I'll be fine. Thor set his hammer down, so that he could take her hands in his. Sybil, promise me you will stay safe. I will seek out Odin, fight this monster, and get free of this curse. I will return for you, Aston Min. I swear it. She believed him. One kiss. Long enough for her to want it to go on forever, but too short for what might be farewell. She might not like it, but she knew this was the right thing to do. Thor released her and raced out the door, with Loki on his heels. Sybil sighed. She wanted to shout after them to wait, that she wanted to come too, but what good would that do? Loki might have called her a witch, but she was no more magical than, well, the stones beneath her feet. She kicked one, and it went bouncing off into the darkness. What she really wanted to do was throw a tantrum of epic proportions. In the privacy of her tent, where no one would see. Where she could scream her frustrations into her pillow, at falling for a Viking warrior who might never come home. The tent was empty, thank goodness. Jurun must be in the bathroom or something. Sybil picked up her pillow. Oh, thank fuck I found you. Quick, pack your things, we have to go. Wait, not everything. Just enough for a couple of nights away. Pack light. Jurun grabbed her backpack and began stuffing clothes into it. Where are we going? Sybil asked. With Thor and Loki, of course. You don't think those two can take care of things on their own, do you? Neither of them can operate a phone, or any form of modern tech, and they know next to nothing about our world. They need us, but we have to be quick. She stuffed an extra pair of socks into her backpack and cinched it closed, then zipped up her coat. She grabbed Sybil's hand. Come on, let's go. This has been Thor, a Paranormal Protector Tale. Book 1 in the Heart of Ice series. Written by Demelza Carlton.